The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it or they don't agree on how it works. And this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economic template. Though it's unconventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep for global financial crisis. And it has worked well for me for over 30 years. 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple, mechanical way. It's made up of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again, zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create their main forces that drive the economy. Number 1, productive growth. Number 2, the short-term debt cycle. Number 3, the long-term debt cycle. Well, look at these three forces and how link them on top of each other create a good template for tracking economy movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simple part of the economy transaction. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up. And a transaction is a very simple thing. You make a transaction all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial asset. Credit spent just like money. So, adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you couldn't know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If we divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economy machine. All cycles in all processes in an economy are driven by transactions. So, if we can understand the transaction, we can understand the why economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers market transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wide market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all the transactions in all of its market. If we add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the market, that's everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments are engaged in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The possessed buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rate and printing new money. For these reasons as well see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the busiest and most volatile volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford like a house or car. Or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal plus, and an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. And two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. This seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. Lenders are really right. Liability. In the future, when the borrower repays, the loan plus interest, the asset, and the liability disappear. And the transaction is settled. And the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns on, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So, when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income less, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because no, he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has valuable asset to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increases income allows increases borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing and so on. But this self-reflection, reinforcing pattern, leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something. And how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn and that accumulated knowledge raises our living standards. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raise their productivity and their living standards better than those who are complacent and lazy. But that isn't necessary to over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much so. Fluctuate too much, so it's not a big driver of economic swing. That is because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it. Any process used to consume less than we produce. When we have to pay it back, debt swings occur into big cycles. One takes about 5 and 7 years, and the other takes about 75 and 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too, of course, day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we are going to step back and look at these three big processes and how they interact to make up our experiences. As men know, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which require me to be more productive and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. Since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you credit a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create the cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical predicative series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is when you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together you and the bartender credit and asset and a liability. You just create out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset you the liability disappear. The debit goes away, the transaction is zero. The reality is that most of that people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is over $50 trillion, and the total amount of the debit goes away, the transaction is zero. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and earns incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now don't get me wrong, credit is the necessary something hard that just causes cycles. It's bad when finance overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, if it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt, but if you borrow money to buy a tractor and the tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit create growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $10,000 a year and have no debt. You are credit worth enough to borrow $1,000, say on credit card. So you can spend $1,010 even though you only earn $1,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $1,010. The person earning $1,010 with no debt can borrow $11. So he can spend $1,021 even though he has only earned $1,010. His spending is another person's income. And by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing credit cycle. And if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see expansion. The first phase of the short-term debt cycle, spending continues and increases, and prices start to rise. This happens because the increases is in spending is fueled by credit, which can be credited externally out of thin air. When the amount of spending, the incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want much inflation because it causes problems. Selling prices rise, it raises interest rate. With higher interest rate, where people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of exchanging debt rise. Think about this as the monthly payment on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt payments, they have less money left over to spend. So spending slows, and since a person's spending is another person's incomes dropped, and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And you see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is concentrated only by the built-in weakness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit is easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debit cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth in the previous cycle and with more debit. Why? Because people foresee it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debt lies faster than it comes credit the long-term debt cycle. This feed people becoming more indebted, and there's even more for the explain credit. Why? Because everyone think things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. As the value grew up, the stock market lost its boom. It has to buy goods, service, and financial assets with borrowed money. When people do a lot of that, we call it bubble. So, even though debt have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly past offset them. Let's call the ratio of debt income the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, as the value is soared, people borrow huge amounts of money to buy assets as investment, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel worthy, so even with the accumulation of a lot of debt, rising incomes and asset value help borrowers remain credit-worthy for a long time. But this evolution cannot continue forever, and it doesn't. Over decades, debt burden slowly increases, creating larger and larger debt repayment. At some point, debt repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back to their spending. And since one person's spending and another person's incomes begin to go down, which make people less credit-worthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayment continue to rise, which makes spending drop ever further. And the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burden has simply because too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 208. It happened for the same reason. It happened in Japan in 1980 and in the United States back in 1929. And now the economy begins deleveraging. In the deleveraging, people cut spending. Income pay credit disappear. Asset prices drop. Bank get squeezed. The stock market crashes. Social tensions rise, and the wild thing starts to pit of itself the other way. As incomes fade, the debt repayments rise. Borrowers get squeezed. Borrowers get squeezed. No longer credit-worthy, credit drives up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scramble to fill this void. Borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets follows the market at the same time as spending fails. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collector borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less credit worthy. People fear for trade, irrefutably this fear. Less spending, less income, less water, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to recession, but the difference here is the interest rates can be borrowed to save the debt. And in recession lowering interest rate work to stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rate doesn't work because interest rate are already low and hit 0%. So the stimulation and interest rate in the United States has 0%, burning the leveraging of the 1930 and again in 208. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rate. Lenders rarely realize that debt have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay, and their collector has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending. Borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not credit or just like an individual. So, what do you do about the leveraging? The problem is that burden are too high and must come down. There are four ways this can happen. 1. People, business, and government cut their spending. 2. Debt are reduced through defaults and restructuring. 3. Which is restructuring from the haves to the have-not. And finally, 4. The central bank prints new money. These four ways have been in every deliverance is modern history. Usually spending is cut first. As we just saw, people, businesses, and even governments tighten their belt and cut their spending so that we can pay down their debt. This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debt and start paying down old debt, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the upside happens because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income. It costs income to pay. The fail faster than debit are repaid, and the debit burden actually gets worse. As we've seen, this cut in spending is definitely and painful. Businesses are proceed to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher employment. This leads to the next stage. Debt must reduce. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, and the borrowers or debit are rendered asset. When a borrower doesn't repay, the bank people get governments that bank won't be able to repay them. So they decide to withdraw with their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed and people, businesses, and banks default their debt. This third economic contraction is depression. A big part of the depression is people discovering much of what they thought what their real world is little there. Let's go back to the bar. When you dab a beer and put it on a bar tab, you promise to repay the bartender. You promise to become an asset of the bartender. But if you break your promise, if you don't pay him back and essentially default on your bar tab, then the asset he has isn't really worth anything. It has basically disappeared. Many vendors don't when they're to disappear and agree to debit restructuring. Debit restructuring means vendors get paid back less or get paid back over a long time frame, or at a lower interest rate than was first agreed. Somehow a contract is broken in a way that reduces debt. Lenders, while further, rather have a little of something than all nothing. Even though debt disappears, debt restructuring causes income and asset value to disappear faster. So, the debt burden continues to get worse. Like cutting spending, debt reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this impacts the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because employment has risen. Many of the employed have quietly saving and need financial support from the government. Additionally, government credits stimulus plans and increases their standing to make up for these decreases in the economy. Government budget difficulties exploit in the rising because they spend more than earn in taxes. This is what's happening when you hear about the budget deficit on the news. To fund their deficits, the government needed to either raise taxes or borrow money. But it incompletely ends so many employed, who is the money going to come from? The rich. Since government need more money and since the world is heavily concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of the people, governments naturally raise taxes on the wealth which facilitated a redistribution of wealth in the economy from the haves to have-nots. But have-nots who are aspiring begin to resent the world haves. The world have been squeezed by the weak economy. Falling asset prices and higher taxes begin to resent the have-nots. If the depression continues, social disorder can break out. Not only do tensions rise with countries, they can rise between countries, especially better incredible countries. This situation can lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 1930s, this led to Hitler coming to power, war in Europe, and depression in the United States. The pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Remember, most of what people do was money was actually credit. So, when credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People are desperate for money. And you remember who can print money? And central banks can. And the central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rate to near zero, it proceeded to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and world redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulus eventually, and the central bank prints and money out of them. Aaron used it to buy financial as the government bonds. It happened in the United States during the Great Depression and again in 208 when the United States Central Bank It happened in the United States during the Great Depression and again in 208 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could print buying financial assets with this money. It helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets. You see, the central bank can print money, but if it can only buy financial assets, the central government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people. So, in order to stimulate the economy, the two must cooperate by buying government bonds. The central bank essentially lends money to the government, allowing it to run a deficit. And increases spending on goods and services through its stimulatory programs and employment benefits. This increases people's income whereas the government debt. However, it will lower the economy's total debt burden. This is very risky time. Policymakers need to balance the four ways that debt burdens come down.